In the summer of 1979, Highway 12 in rural Louisiana was known to truckers as a quiet, safe route, a peaceful alternative to the busy interstates where experienced drivers could make good time without the stress of heavy traffic. It was a road where courtesy and mutual respect still meant something in the trucking community. But sometimes, even the simplest situations can trigger unimaginable consequences. This is the true story of how a common mechanical problem, a broken horn, escalated into one of the most tragic episodes in American highway history. Note, this dramatization is based on real events, but some details have been changed to protect the privacy of those involved. The purpose is educational, showing how seemingly minor conflicts can escalate when dialogue and understanding are abandoned. Before we begin, we'd like to ask you to tell us your name and the city you're watching from. We love getting to know our audience. Also, please don't forget to give this video a like, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. That way, we can keep bringing you more stories like this one. Tommy Broussard adjusted the rearview mirror of his Peterbilt 359 as he navigated Highway 12 that July morning. The Louisiana heat was already building, promising another scorching day for drivers working the southern routes. Tommy knew every curve of this road. For 8 years, he'd been hauling freight between Houston and Mobile, and Highway 12 was his preferred choice to avoid the chaos of the interstates. At 34, Tommy represented what was best about the trucking community: professional, respectful, and always ready to help a fellow driver in trouble. His wife Marie and 10-year-old daughter Sarah were waiting for him at home in Baton Rouge, and he never failed to call them during his trips. Just that morning, he'd promised Sarah he'd be home in time for her school play on Friday evening, a promise he intended to keep. Breaker 19, this is Cajun Thunder to any drivers on Highway 12. He spoke into his CB radio, using his road handle. Anyone got ears on about that construction zone near Covington? The response came immediately. Cajun Thunder, this is Iron Horse. Lanes down to 1 near mile marker 47. Backup's running about 20 minutes. Tommy acknowledged and settled in for the wait. He was hauling drilling equipment bound for an offshore platform in the Gulf, and his delivery schedule allowed for the usual delays that came with summer construction season. The load was valuable, nearly $40,000 worth of specialized machinery, but routine for someone with Tommy's experience. What he didn't know was that overnight, while parked at a rest area outside Houston, a loose electrical connection had developed in his air horn system. The vibration from miles of highway travel had gradually worked the wire free, creating a malfunction that would cause the horn to stick when activated. It was the kind of minor mechanical issue that could happen to any truck on any day to any driver. The kind of problem that usually resulted in nothing more than embarrassment and a quick repair. Today would be different. Traffic was moving slower than Iron Horse had predicted. Tommy found himself crawling along at walking speed, surrounded by other trucks in an impromptu convoy. The heat was becoming unbearable despite his air conditioning, and he rolled down his window, letting the humid Louisiana air flow through the cab. The CB radio chattered constantly with updates and complaints about the delay, the familiar voices of regular drivers mixing with occasional newcomers to the route. "This backup's worse than Mardi Gras traffic," complained a driver called Bayou Bill. "Been sitting here 25 minutes and moved maybe half a mile." "Tell me about it," responded another voice. "At this rate, I'm going to be late for my delivery in Pensacola." Tommy listened to the banter with the comfortable familiarity of someone who'd been part of this community for years. These men were more than fellow drivers. They were a brotherhood bound together by shared challenges, mutual respect, and an unwritten code that said you always helped another trucker in need. It was a code that had served Tommy well over the years, and one he'd never had reason to question. That's when he first noticed the black Kenworth in his mirrors. The truck was following unusually close to his rear bumper, close enough to make Tommy uncomfortable. It was unfamiliar, not one of the regulars who worked this route. Its chrome was polished to a mirror finish, and dark-tinted windows made it impossible to see the driver. Everything about it seemed designed to intimidate, from its aggressive positioning to its pristine condition that suggested money behind the operation. Tommy had seen trucks like this before, usually belonging to drivers who ran specialty freight or worked for companies with deep pockets, but there was something about this one that made him uneasy. Maybe it was the way it maintained that dangerously close following distance, Or maybe it was the fact that its driver hadn't acknowledged any of the ongoing CB chatter about the traffic delay. "Hey there, Black Kenworth running behind the Peterbilt with Louisiana plates," Tommy called on the CB, keeping his tone friendly and professional. "You're sitting pretty tight back there, partner. Might want to give yourself some stopping distance in this heat." No response. The Kenworth maintained its aggressive position, so close now that Tommy could no longer see its front bumper in his mirrors. This kind of tailgating wasn't just discourteous, it was dangerous, especially with heavy loads in stop-and-go traffic. If Tommy had to brake suddenly, the Kenworth would have no time to react. Tommy tried again, this time with a slightly more direct approach. "Black Kenworth, this is the Peterbilt you're following. I'd appreciate a little more room back there. These loads don't stop on a dime." Still nothing. The silence on the CB was becoming as unsettling as the truck's behavior. In Tommy's experience, even the most antisocial drivers would at least acknowledge a direct safety request. This complete lack of response suggested something more troubling than simple bad manners. Traffic began moving again, slowly at first, then picking up speed as they passed the construction zone. Tommy accelerated gradually, hoping the Kenworth would back off and allow normal following distance. Instead, the black truck moved even closer, now so tight that Tommy could see the reflection of his own trailer in its polished chrome bumper. Other drivers on the CB began commenting on the situation, recognizing the building tension between the two trucks. "Looks like somebody's got an attitude problem out there," observed a driver called Moondog. "Black Kenworth, you need to check your following distance, son." "That's not safe driving," added another voice. "You'll need to sort this out before somebody gets hurt." Still no response from the aggressive driver. Tommy's patience was beginning to wear thin. He'd been driving professionally for nearly a decade without a serious incident, and he wasn't about to let someone's bad attitude cause an accident that could end his career or, worse, cost someone their life. The construction zone was finally behind them, and traffic began to spread out as drivers resumed normal highway speeds. Tommy hoped this would end the confrontation, but his relief was premature. The Kenworth suddenly swung into the left lane and began to overtake, pulling alongside Tommy's cab. This was Tommy's chance to see what kind of driver had been harassing him. As the black truck pulled even with his cab, he glanced over, expecting to see perhaps a young hothead or an experienced driver having a particularly bad day. What he saw instead was more unsettling than either option. The Kenworth's driver was a lean man in his late 30s or early 40s, with the weathered features of someone who'd spent years on the road. But there was something hard about his appearance that went beyond the usual wear of long-haul driving. His mirror sunglasses reflected Tommy's image back at him, and his mouth was set in a grim line that suggested this confrontation was far from over. As the two trucks ran side by side at highway speed, Tommy decided to use his air horn, a standard courtesy signal to let the other driver know he was there and to hopefully defuse whatever tension had built up between them. It was a gesture of professional courtesy, the kind of communication that had prevented countless accidents over the years. Tommy reached up and pressed the horn button, expecting the brief, sharp blast that would signal his presence. Instead, the electrical malfunction caused the horn to stick, creating a continuous ear-splitting wail that echoed across the highway like an air raid siren. The effect was immediate and devastating. The Kenworth's driver turned toward Tommy's cab, his face contorting with rage. Even through the sunglasses and the noise of the engines, Tommy could see that the man interpreted the stuck horn not as a malfunction, but as a deliberate insult, a challenge issued publicly over the highway. Tommy immediately recognized the problem and began working frantically to disconnect the horn. He tried the button repeatedly, then reached for the fuse panel, all while maintaining control of his truck at highway speed. The horn continued its relentless blaring for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 15 or 20 seconds. When he finally managed to silence it, Tommy immediately tried to signal his apology to the Kenworth's driver. He waved through his side window, pointed at his horn, and shook his head to indicate it had been unintentional. He grabbed his CB microphone and tried to explain. "Black Kenworth, this is the Peterbilt. That was a malfunction, partner. My horn stuck. I apologize for that." But the damage was already done. The Kenworth's driver wasn't interested in explanations or apologies. Instead, He began swerving aggressively toward Tommy's truck, forcing the heavily loaded Peterbilt toward the shoulder of the highway. "What's gotten into this guy?" Tommy muttered, fighting to maintain control of his truck while avoiding the guardrail that separated the highway from a steep embankment. The drilling equipment in his trailer shifted ominously as he was forced to make sudden corrections to his steering. The CB radio erupted with concerned voices as other drivers witnessed the dangerous maneuvering taking place in front of them. "Breaker! Breaker! You got a serious situation developing on eastbound Highway 12, came an urgent voice. "That Kenworth's trying to force the Peterbilt off the road." "Somebody call the state police," suggested another driver. "This is going to end bad if it keeps up." "State police don't patrol this stretch regular," responded a veteran driver. "Help could be an hour away." The aggressive driver finally pulled ahead of Tommy's truck and took position directly in front of him. Tommy hoped the incident was over, that perhaps the man had vented his anger and would now return to normal highway behavior. But his relief was short-lived. The Kenworth began what truckers call brake checking, suddenly slowing down to force the vehicle behind to brake hard. With Tommy's heavy load, each sudden stop required pumping his air brakes and fighting to maintain control, as 40 tons of truck and cargo fought against the laws of physics. This was no longer about road courtesy or even road rage. This was systematic harassment designed to force Tommy into a dangerous situation. He'd heard rumors about certain highway stretches where organized groups controlled the flow of traffic, demanding payments or intimidating independent drivers who didn't comply with their unofficial rules. He'd always dismissed these stories as urban legends, the kind of tall tales that grew with each telling in truck stop cafeterias. Now he was beginning to wonder if those stories might have been true. The harassment continued for several miles, each brake check more dangerous than the last. Tommy's air brakes hissed and squealed as he fought to avoid a rear-end collision that would likely prove fatal. Other truckers on the CB offered support and advice, but there was little they could actually do except bear witness to what was happening. "Cajun Thunder, you need to take the next exit," advised a veteran driver called Preacher, whose calm voice carried the authority of someone who'd seen it all during decades on the road. "Don't let this character box you in on the interstate where you got no options." Tommy considered the advice. Getting off the highway would give him more maneuvering room and potentially access to help, but it would also take him away from the witness protection provided by other drivers. It was a calculated risk either way. But as Tommy approached the next exit, the black Kenworth moved to block his path, making the decision for him. It was becoming clear that this wasn't random road rage or even personal animosity. This was a deliberate, coordinated effort to control his movement and force him into a specific situation. The realization sent a chill down Tommy's spine despite the summer heat. Professional drivers developed instincts about danger over years of experience, and every instinct Tommy possessed was now screaming warnings. Whatever was happening here was bigger than one angry driver, and it was escalating towards something he might not be able to handle alone. The CB radio crackled with a new voice, one Tommy hadn't heard before. It was cold, authoritative, and carried an undertone of threat that made his blood run cold. "Driver of the white Peterbilt with Louisiana plates and the busted horn, you showed serious disrespect to the wrong people today. Take exit 52 at the mile marker ahead, and we'll discuss this situation properly." Tommy's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as the full scope of his predicament became clear. Somehow his malfunctioning horn had triggered the attention of what appeared to be an organized group operating along this stretch of highway. He could see other trucks in his mirrors now, all maintaining suspicious positions around him. The casual chatter on the CB had been replaced by tense silence, as if every driver on the frequency suddenly understood that they were witnessing something that could change everything. Mile marker 52 was approaching fast. The exit led to Boudreaux's Landing, a truck stop Tommy had visited dozens of times over the years for fuel, coffee, and the occasional meal. It had always been a safe haven, a place where drivers could rest and recharge before continuing their journeys. The thought of it becoming the site of a confrontation filled him with dread. But Tommy was beginning to understand that he might not have a choice in the matter. The vehicles surrounding him were moving with military precision, cutting off his options one by one. Whatever had started with a broken horn was now completely beyond his control. As he guided his Peterbilt toward the exit ramp, Tommy thought about Marie and Sarah back home in Baton Rouge. His wife would be starting dinner soon, expecting his usual check-in call. Sarah would be practicing for her school play, counting on her father to be there to watch her perform. Simple, normal family moments that suddenly seemed precious and fragile. Tommy had always believed that if you treated people with respect and conducted yourself professionally, you could avoid most of the dangers that lurked along America's highways. He'd never imagined that a mechanical malfunction, something completely beyond his control, could put everything he cared about at risk. But as he took exit 52 and saw Boudreaux's landing ahead in the gathering dusk, Tommy Broussard realized that sometimes respect and professionalism weren't enough. Sometimes the random failures of man and machine could conspire to create situations where good intentions meant nothing and survival depended on factors far beyond anyone's control. The broken horn that had started this nightmare would eventually be repaired for less than $40 at a shop in Mobile. But the events it had set in motion would change the lives of everyone involved and become part of the dark legend of Highway 12. A reminder that even in modern America, civilization was often just one mechanical failure away from chaos. Tommy's heart hammered against his ribs as he guided his Peterbilt down the exit ramp toward Boudreaux's landing. The truck stop sat nestled in a grove of ancient live oaks, draped with Spanish moss, their branches creating shadows that seemed to reach across the parking lot like gnarled fingers. Neon signs flickered in the growing dusk, advertising diesel fuel, hot food, and cold beer to weary travelers. Under normal circumstances, Tommy would have found the scene comforting. Boudreaux's landing had been a regular stop for him over the years, a place where he could grab a decent meal, top off his fuel tanks, and maybe catch a few hours of sleep in his sleeper berth. The owner, an elderly Cajun man named Marcel Boudreaux, had always treated drivers fairly and maintained a clean, safe facility. But tonight, everything felt different. As Tommy pulled into the parking lot, he immediately noticed things that set his nerves on edge. Despite the early evening hour, there were very few customer vehicles around the main building. The trucks that were parked seemed positioned with unusual precision, as if they'd been arranged rather than simply left where their drivers had stopped for the night. More concerning was the silence. Truck stops were usually bustling with activity, drivers moving between vehicles, customers coming and going from the main building, the constant sounds of engines starting and stopping. But Boudreaux's landing seemed frozen in an unnatural quiet, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen. Tommy parked near the main building, hoping the proximity to other people might provide some protection. But as he shut down his engine and looked around more carefully, he realized his hope was misplaced. The building looked nearly empty, with only a few dim lights visible through the windows. Even more troubling, he could see that many of the trucks in the lot were idling, their drivers apparently still in their cabs. The black Kenworth that had forced him off the highway pulled into a spot directly across from Tommy's truck, its driver making no move to exit the vehicle. Within minutes, several other trucks began arriving, the same vehicles that had been shadowing him on the interstate. They took positions around the lot with the kind of coordination that suggested military planning rather than coincidental arrivals. Tommy reached for his CB microphone, hoping to raise someone who might be able to help. "Any drivers monitoring Channel 19, this is Cajun Thunder at Boudreaux's Landing. Exit 52 on Highway 12. I've got a situation developing here and could use some advice." The response came not from his radio, but from outside his truck. The driver of the black Kenworth had finally emerged from his cab and was walking purposefully toward Tommy's Peterbilt. In the fluorescent lighting of the parking lot, Tommy could see him clearly for the first time. The man was lean and weathered, probably in his early 40s, with the kind of hard features that suggested a difficult life. His clothes were clean but worn, and he moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Most concerning was his demeanor. There was no anger in his expression now, no road rage or momentary fury. Instead, he displayed the calm professionalism of someone conducting routine business. Behind him, other drivers were emerging from their trucks. Tommy counted at least 8 men, all moving with the same purposeful stride toward his Peterbilt. They weren't rushing or shouting, This was clearly a well-rehearsed procedure. The lead driver reached Tommy's cab and gestured for him to roll down his window. When Tommy hesitated, the man's jacket fell open slightly, revealing what looked like a holstered pistol. The gesture seemed casual, almost accidental, but Tommy understood it was anything but. "Evening, driver," the man said, his voice carrying a slight southern accent. "Name's Carter Mills. I think we need to have a conversation about what happened out there on the highway." Tommy's mouth felt dry as he rolled down his window. "Look, I already explained on the radio. That was a malfunction. My horn stuck. I wasn't trying to disrespect anybody." Carter nodded thoughtfully. "I heard your explanation. Problem is, intent don't really matter in this situation. What matters is what other drivers saw and heard, and what they saw was you laying on your horn at one of my trucks in front of half the drivers on Highway 12. "Your trucks?" Tommy tried to keep his voice steady. "I don't understand what you mean." "I run security operations for this stretch of highway," Carter explained patiently. "Have for the past 3 years, ever since the state police cut back their patrols through here. Me and my associates provide protection services for drivers using this route." Tommy felt his stomach sink as the pieces began falling into place. Protection from what? Carter smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "From us, mainly. See, this ain't the same highway it was 10 years ago. Lot of changes in the trucking industry. Companies cutting rates, squeezing drivers until they can barely make expenses. Independent operators going bankrupt left and right." As Carter spoke, more of his associates positioned themselves around Tommy's truck. They weren't obviously threatening, but their presence was clearly intended to discourage any thoughts of escape. "So some of us decided to take control of our own destiny," Carter continued. "We identified stretches of highway where law enforcement was spread thin, and we set up our own operations. Drivers who want safe passage through our territory pay a reasonable fee. Think of it as a toll road, except the toll goes to people who actually work for a living, instead of government bureaucrats." Tommy's mind raced as he tried to understand the situation. "How much of a fee?" "Depends on the cargo and the driver's attitude," Carter replied. "Standard rate is 10% of load value for regular freight, but your little horn incident out there, that was public disrespect. Public disrespect requires a public response, or other drivers start getting ideas about challenging our authority." The implications of Carter's words hit Tommy like a physical blow. 10% of his cargo value would be $4,000, more than his profit margin for the entire trip. He'd actually lose money on the run, and with his truck payments and family expenses, he couldn't afford that kind of loss. "I can't pay that kind of money," Tommy said. "I'm an independent operator. My margins are already tight." Carter's expression didn't change. "Then you should have thought about that before you decided to disrespect us in front of other drivers." Before Tommy could respond, the sound of another truck pulling into the lot caught everyone's attention. A blue Mack conventional with Georgia plates rolled past the main building, its driver clearly looking for a parking spot. Tommy watched as the truck's CB antenna swayed in the evening breeze, and he realized this innocent driver was about to stumble into the same nightmare. "Looks like we got another customer," observed one of Carter's men, a massive individual who looked like he could bench press a small car. Carter nodded. "Bull, go have a conversation with our new arrival. Might as well make this a teaching moment." As the man called Bull began walking toward the blue Mack, Tommy felt a surge of desperation. Whatever was about to happen, he couldn't let an innocent driver get caught up in it. But with nearly a dozen men surrounding his truck, his options were severely limited. The blue Mack's driver had shut down his engine and was climbing out of his cab, completely unaware of the danger approaching him. Tommy could see the man clearly now, older, probably in his late 50s, with grey hair and the slightly stooped posture of someone who'd been driving for decades. "Hey!" Tommy called out, his voice carrying across the parking lot. "Sir, you might want to get back in your truck." The warning came too late. Bull had already reached the blue Mack, and Tommy watched helplessly as the massive man grabbed the grey-haired driver and began escorting him toward the group surrounding Tommy's truck. "Well now," Carter said, satisfaction evident in his voice, "looks like we got ourselves a 2-for-1 situation tonight. This could turn out to be quite profitable." The older driver was clearly confused and frightened as Bull guided him into the circle of men. His name patch read Earl, and his Georgia accent was thick with bewilderment as he looked around at the situation he'd stumbled into. "What in tarnation is going on here?" Earl demanded, his voice shaking despite his attempt to sound defiant. "Y'all got no right to put your hands on me. I'm just trying to get some fuel before heading to New Orleans." Carter stepped forward, his manner shifting to accommodate the new arrival. "Well, Earl from Georgia, you just drove into an educational opportunity. See, we're having a discussion about highway courtesy and respect, and you're about to learn why both are important when you're traveling through our territory." Earl's confusion was evident. "Your territory? This is a public highway." "Not anymore," Carter replied. "This stretch of Highway 12 is under private management now. Drivers who want safe passage through here pay a reasonable fee for security services." Tommy could see the exact moment when Earl realized this wasn't a case of mistaken identity or a simple misunderstanding. The color drained from the older man's face as he took in the coordinated positioning of the trucks and the number of men surrounding them. "I don't want any trouble," Earl said, his voice now barely above a whisper. "I'm just trying to make a living, same as everyone else." "And that's exactly what we're doing," Carter replied. "The difference is we've figured out how to make a decent living in an industry that's been trying to squeeze drivers into poverty for the past decade." Tommy found himself speaking up, partly from desperation and partly from genuine outrage at what he was witnessing. "This isn't making a living, this is robbery." Carter turned back to Tommy, his expression hardening. "Robbery? That's an interesting way to look at it. I prefer to think of it as taxation without representation. The government takes our money and gives us nothing but regulations and inspections. The shipping companies take our money and give us rates that barely cover fuel costs. So we decided to cut out the middlemen and deal directly with the people who use our roads." As Carter spoke, Tommy noticed movement in his peripheral vision. Another truck was turning into the parking lot, a red and white Kenworth with Arkansas plates. The new arrival seemed to hesitate when he saw the unusual gathering of vehicles, but continued toward an empty parking spot near the back of the lot. "Busy evening," Bull observed. "That makes 3. Carter's eyes lit up with the calculating look of a businessman who'd spotted a new opportunity. "Rodriguez, check on Arkansas when you get done with Georgia's paperwork. Looks like business is picking up." Tommy watched the Arkansas driver shut down his engine and climb out of his cab. The man was younger, probably in his early 30s, with the lean build of someone who stayed in shape despite long hours behind the wheel. He wore a cowboy hat and boots, and moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to handling difficult situations. "This is getting out of hand," Tommy said to Carter. "You can't just shake down every driver who stops here." "Shake down?" Carter's voice carried mock indignation. "We're providing a valuable service. Security, safe passage, protection from the kind of highway pirates that have been plaguing independent drivers for years." "You are the highway pirates," Tommy replied. Carter's smile turned cold. "That's a matter of perspective. From where I stand, we're entrepreneurs who identified a market opportunity and filled it." One of Carter's men, a wiry individual with a thin mustache, approached with a clipboard. "Rodriguez here handles the administrative side of our operation," Carter explained. "He's going to take a look at your bills of lading, calculate your fees based on cargo value." As Rodriguez headed toward Tommy's truck to examine his paperwork, Tommy realized the full scope of what he was facing. This wasn't a spontaneous criminal act or even organized crime in the traditional sense. This was a systematic business operation that had been running long enough to develop procedures, hierarchies, and administrative protocols. The Arkansas driver was approaching the group now, apparently having noticed the tense atmosphere, and decided to investigate rather than retreat. Tommy could see he was trying to assess the situation without appearing threatening, but there was something about his posture that suggested military or law enforcement training. "Evening, gentlemen," the Arkansas driver said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone trying to avoid trouble. "Y'all having some kind of meeting?" Carter stepped forward with the same professional demeanor he'd shown with Tommy and Earl. "Name's Carter Mills. I coordinate security operations for this section of Highway 12. You look like you could use some information about safe travel through this area." The Arkansas driver studied Carter's face for a moment before responding. "Appreciate the offer, but I reckon I can handle myself just fine." There was something in the way the younger man carried himself that caught Carter's attention. "You got a name, Arkansas?" "Jake Morrison. And before you ask, yes, I'm armed. And yes, I know how to use it." The casual admission created a ripple of tension through Carter's men. Most drivers carried weapons for self-defense, but few announced it so openly unless they were prepared to use them. Carter's calculating expression returned. "Well, Mr. Morrison, I appreciate the honesty. Makes things simpler when everyone knows where they stand." Rodriguez returned from Tommy's truck with a folder full of paperwork. Drilling equipment, like he said, wholesale value around $40,000. Standard rate would be $4,000, but given the disrespect incident, he let the sentence hang. "Given the circumstances," Carter said, "I think $12,000 would be more appropriate. 30% instead of the usual 10%. Tommy felt his world spinning. $12,000 would bankrupt him. Even if he mortgaged his truck, he couldn't raise that kind of money on short notice. "I don't have that kind of cash," Tommy said desperately. "Then we'll have to work out alternative arrangements," Carter replied. "We accept cargo transfers, truck titles, or personal guarantees backed by appropriate collateral." Earl, who had been listening in growing horror, finally found his voice. "How long has this been going on?" "About 3 years," Carter answered proudly. "Started small, just a few of us working together to level the playing field. Word spread among drivers who were tired of getting squeezed by the big companies. Now we've got operations on 6 different highway segments across 3 states. The scope of Carter's revelation was staggering. This wasn't an isolated incident or a small-time criminal operation. It was an organized network that had been growing and expanding for years, apparently without interference from law enforcement. Jake Morrison had been listening to the conversation with the kind of focused attention that made Tommy think his initial impression about military training had been correct. "So you're running a protection racket," Jake said, "demanding payment from drivers who just want to do their jobs." Carter's expression hardened. "We're providing security services in areas where law enforcement has abandoned its responsibilities. Independent contractors filling a gap in the market." "And if drivers refuse to pay?" Carter's smile returned, but it was cold as winter. "Then they learn why our security services are so valuable." The threat was clear enough to make Tommy's blood run cold. He looked around at the men surrounding them and realized that Earl, Jake, and himself were completely outnumbered. Even if Jake was armed and trained, 3 men against a dozen was impossible odds. But Jake Morrison didn't seem intimidated by the numbers. If anything, his posture suggested he was assessing the situation tactically, looking for advantages and opportunities rather than surrender options. "Interesting business model," Jake said. "What happens when word gets out? When drivers start avoiding this route altogether?" "Then we expand our operations to other routes," Carter replied. "Market forces, Mr. Morrison, supply and demand." Tommy realized that Carter and his organization represented something more dangerous than simple highway robbery. They were ideologically committed to their vision of controlling freight transportation through intimidation and violence. This wasn't about quick money. It was about power and territory. As the conversation continued, Tommy noticed that the parking lot had grown quieter. The few legitimate customers who had been at the truck stop when they arrived seemed to have disappeared, whether by coincidence or design. Even the building itself looked largely empty now, as if word had somehow spread to avoid the area. The isolation was complete. Whatever was going to happen at Boudreaux's Landing would happen without witnesses, without interference, and without help from the outside world. Tommy thought about Marie and Sarah waiting for his call and wondered if he would ever see them again. The broken horn that had started this nightmare seemed like a lifetime ago. Now it was just one more element in a situation that had spiraled completely beyond anyone's control. The standoff in the parking lot of Boudreaux's Landing had reached a critical point. Tommy could feel the tension building like pressure in a steam boiler, and he knew that whatever happened next would determine whether he, Earl, and Jake Morrison would drive away from this truck stop or never leave at all. Jake Morrison seemed to be the only person present who wasn't intimidated by Carter Mills and his organization. The Arkansas driver stood with his feet slightly apart, his hands relaxed at his sides, but Tommy could see the coiled readiness in his posture. This was a man who had faced dangerous situations before and survived them. "You know," Jake said conversationally, "I spent 2 tours in Vietnam, learned a lot about people who try to control territory through intimidation. Usually doesn't end well for them in the long run." Carter's expression tightened at the mention of military service. "This ain't Vietnam, soldier boy. This is Louisiana, and we know the territory a lot better than you do." "Territory's just geography," Jake replied. "What matters is who's willing to fight for it, and who's fighting for the right reasons." Rodriguez had finished examining Earl's paperwork and approached Carter with the results. Furniture shipment, like he said. Retail value about $15,000. But there's something else. He handed Carter a separate document. "He's carrying a sealed envelope for delivery in New Orleans. Feels substantial." Earl's face went pale. "That's not my money. I'm just making a delivery for a client. If I don't get that to New Orleans, I lose my contract." Carter examined the envelope with interest. "What kind of client pays for special delivery services, Earl?" Earl's reluctance to answer was answer enough. Tommy could see the older driver wrestling with whether to reveal information that might make his situation worse or continue trying to protect his client's privacy. "It's legitimate business," Earl finally said. "I run documents and small packages for various companies. Always have. It's how I supplement my freight income." But Carter was already opening the envelope, counting its contents with the practiced efficiency of someone familiar with handling large amounts of cash. His smile grew wider as he worked through the bills. $25,000, Carter announced to his men. "Looks like Georgia here was carrying more than furniture." Earl broke down at the revelation. "Please, that money doesn't belong to me. I'm just the courier. If I don't deliver it, there'll be consequences." "What kind of consequences?" Carter asked with renewed interest. Through his tears, Earl managed to explain that he occasionally carried money and documents for businesses in Atlanta that had connections in New Orleans. He never asked questions about the nature of the transactions, and his clients never volunteered information. It was a lucrative side business that helped him make ends meet in an industry where profit margins were razor thin. The revelation changed the atmosphere in the parking lot. Carter and his men exchanged glances that suggested they understood the implications of stealing money from organized crime figures. "This complicates things," Carter muttered. "If this money belongs to connected people, taking it could bring heat we're not prepared for." Jake Morrison seized on the moment of uncertainty. "Sounds like you boys bit off more than you can chew. Maybe it's time to let these drivers go their way before things get worse." But Carter was already formulating a new plan, one that would prove more dangerous than simple highway robbery. "Or maybe it's time to expand our operation. If there are regular money runs between Atlanta and New Orleans, we need to get ourselves a piece of that action." Bull Morrison, the massive enforcer who had been silent until now, looked uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "Carter, messing with organized crime is different from shaking down independent truckers. These people have resources we can't match." "Every organization starts small," Carter replied dismissively. "Besides, what's the worst that could happen? They send some shooters up from New Orleans. We've got shooters too." Tommy realized the situation was spiraling into something that could trigger a war between Carter's highway operation and criminal organizations in Louisiana. The broken horn that had started this nightmare was beginning to seem like the least of anyone's worries. Jake Morrison apparently reached the same conclusion. "This is bigger than truck stop robbery now. You're talking about declaring war on people who make their living through violence." "Violence is just another business tool," Carter replied. "The key is knowing when and how to use it effectively." As Carter spoke, Tommy noticed another truck pulling into the parking lot. This one was different from the others. A pristine white Peterbilt with custom paint and enough chrome to blind a person in daylight. The driver who emerged was equally impressive, a large man in his 50s with the bearing of someone accustomed to respect and authority. "Who's that?" Carter asked, suddenly sounding less confident. Bull Morrison squinted toward the new arrival. "That's Big Jim Thibodeau from New Iberia. Runs the most successful independent freight operation in South Louisiana." The mention of the name caused a visible reaction among Carter's men. Even in a criminal organization, certain reputations commanded respect, and Big Jim Thibodeau was apparently one of them. He's got connections with everyone from shipping companies to state politicians, Bull continued. If he's here, it ain't by accident. Big Jim approached the group with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never backed down from a confrontation in his life. His presence seemed to fill the parking lot, and even Carter's most aggressive men stepped aside to let him pass. "Evening, gentlemen," Big Jim said, his voice carrying the authority of decades in the trucking business. "Heard there was some kind of discussion taking place about highway operations and driver safety." Carter tried to regain control of the situation. "Just conducting some routine business, Mr. Thibodeau. Nothing that concerns you. When it involves drivers being intimidated on Louisiana highways, it concerns me," Big Jim replied. "I've been hauling freight through this state for 30 years, and I've never seen anything like what I'm looking at tonight." Tommy felt a surge of hope as he realized that help might have arrived in the form of this legendary figure in the Louisiana trucking community. But he also understood that Big Jim's presence might escalate the situation beyond anyone's ability to control it. "We're providing security services," Carter explained, his voice less steady than before. "Independent contractors filling a gap in law enforcement coverage." Big Jim's laugh was harsh and dismissive. "Security services? Son, what you're running here is a protection racket, pure and simple, and it's about to come to an end." The parking lot fell silent except for the distant hum of idling diesel engines. Tommy could smell the thick Louisiana air, heavy with moisture and the scent of diesel fuel. Somewhere in the distance, a freight train whistle echoed across the bayou, a lonely sound that reminded him of home and everything he stood to lose. Carter's men began positioning themselves more aggressively, apparently preparing for a confrontation with Big Jim and anyone who might support him. But Big Jim seemed unconcerned by their movements. "You boys might want to reconsider your career choices," Big Jim said calmly. "What you're doing here tonight is going to bring attention you don't want. State police, federal investigators, maybe even some folks from New Orleans who don't appreciate their business being interrupted." Earl whimpered at the mention of New Orleans, clearly understanding the implications better than anyone else present. Jake Morrison stepped closer to Big Jim, apparently recognizing an ally in the developing situation. "These men have been extorting money from drivers for 3 years. They've got operations on multiple highway segments." Big Jim's expression grew darker as he absorbed this information. 3 years and nobody reported it? "Hard to report something when the victims are too scared to talk," Jake replied. "And when law enforcement presence is thin enough that these operations can exist without interference." Tommy found himself speaking up, desperation giving him courage he didn't know he possessed. "They're demanding $12,000 from me because my horn malfunctioned and they considered it disrespectful." Big Jim turned his attention to Tommy, taking in the details of his truck and his obvious distress. "You're the driver with the broken horn? The one whose CB chatter brought me out here tonight?" Tommy was confused. "My CB chatter?" "Word travels fast on the trucking networks," Big Jim explained. "When a driver calls for help on Highway 12, other drivers listen. Some of them called me knowing I had connections that might be able to help." The revelation that Tommy's desperate call for assistance had reached beyond the immediate area gave him hope that this nightmare might have an end. But it also made him realize how quickly the situation could escalate beyond anyone's ability to control it. Carter Mills was clearly losing control of the situation he had thought he commanded. The arrival of Big Jim Thibodeau and the revelation that word of the highway extortion had spread throughout the trucking community meant that his organization's secret operations were secret no longer. "This ain't over," Carter said, his voice carrying a desperate edge. "We've invested too much time and effort building this operation to let it be destroyed by a bunch of do-gooders and heroes." Big Jim's response was calm, but filled with finality. "Yes, it is. Your operation ends tonight, one way or another." As the two men faced each other across the parking lot, Tommy realized that the broken horn incident had unleashed forces that went far beyond his individual situation. The informal networks that held the trucking community together were mobilizing against Carter's criminal organization, and the confrontation at Boudreaux's Landing was about to become something much larger than a simple robbery. The humid Louisiana air seemed to press down on them all as they waited to see who would make the first move in what had become a battle for the soul of Highway 12. Rodriguez approached Carter with obvious nervousness. "Boss, we got company on the perimeter. Looks like more trucks arriving, and some of them are carrying people who aren't drivers." Carter's confidence cracked visibly as he realized that his isolated truck stop had become the center of attention from forces he couldn't control. The criminal organization he had built through intimidation and violence was about to face opponents who possessed resources and connections that dwarfed his own. "How many?" Carter asked. "6 trucks so far, maybe 20 people total." "And Carter," Rodriguez's voice dropped to a whisper, "some of them are carrying hardware that makes our pistols look like toys." Tommy felt a mixture of relief and terror as he understood that rescue was arriving, but that the cost of that rescue might be measured in lives lost in the coming confrontation. The broken horn that had started this chain of events was about to become the catalyst for something that would be remembered long after the mechanical failure was repaired. Big Jim Thibodeau seemed to sense the shift in momentum. "Carter, you've got one chance to end this without bloodshed. Release these drivers, return their money, and surrender to the authorities when they arrive." Carter looked around at his diminishing options and the growing number of opponents surrounding his position. The criminal empire he had built was crumbling in real time, and he faced a choice between surrender and a fight he couldn't win. "I've got too much invested to walk away," Carter finally said. "If this ends tonight, it ends with a fight." Big Jim nodded sadly, as if he had expected that response, but hoped for better. "Then God help us all, because what happens next is going to change everything." The stage was set for a confrontation that would transform a simple truck stop into the site of one of the most significant battles in the history of American trucking. And at the center of it all was Tommy Broussard, whose broken horn had somehow triggered a war between forces he was only beginning to understand. The arrival of Big Jim Thibodeau's reinforcements transformed the parking lot of Boudreaux's Landing into something resembling a military staging area. Tommy watched in amazement as truck after truck rolled into the lot, each one carrying experienced drivers who had responded to the call for help. These weren't random truckers who had stumbled into the situation. They were men who had dropped whatever they were doing and driven through the night to answer a distress call from a fellow driver. Among the arrivals, Tommy recognized some faces from previous trips through Louisiana. There was Claude Hebert, who ran a small fleet out of Lafayette and was known for his integrity and fairness. Marcel Tran, a Vietnamese immigrant who had built a successful operation hauling petroleum products and was respected throughout the Gulf Coast. Bobby Landry, from Lake Charles, whose family had been in trucking for 3 generations and who commanded loyalty from drivers across southwestern Louisiana. But it wasn't just the legitimate trucking community that was arriving. Rodriguez's observation about hardware proved accurate as Tommy saw men emerging from the trucks with equipment that went far beyond typical driver protection. These were serious people preparing for a serious confrontation. Big Jim stood at the center of the growing crowd, his presence serving as a unifying force for men who might otherwise have different opinions about how to handle the situation. His reputation in the Louisiana trucking community was legendary. A man who had never compromised his principles, never backed down from bullies, and never forgotten that trucking was about more than just moving freight from one place to another. "Gentlemen," Big Jim announced to the assembled drivers, "we've got a situation here that goes to the heart of what we do for a living. These men," he gestured toward Carter's group, "have been running protection rackets on our highways for 3 years. They've been robbing drivers, intimidating families, and turning our roads into hunting grounds." A murmur of anger ran through the crowd. Tommy could see faces hardening as the implications sank in. For professional drivers, the highways weren't just workplaces, they were home territory, places where they spent more time than anywhere else. The idea that criminals had been preying on their community was a personal insult to every man present. Carter Mills found himself facing odds that had shifted dramatically against him. Where he had commanded the situation an hour earlier with a dozen armed men, he now faced at least 30 drivers, many of whom carried themselves with the bearing of military veterans. More concerning for Carter was the realization that word of his operation had spread beyond the immediate trucking community. "This doesn't have to escalate," Carter called out, trying to project confidence he no longer felt. "We can work something out. Divide territories, establish protocols. There's room for everyone to make money. Jake Morrison stepped forward from the crowd. The only thing that needs to be worked out is you and your people getting off our highways permanently. Earl, still clutching his remaining possessions, found courage in the presence of so many supporters. They stole $25,000 from me, money that belongs to people who don't forgive and don't forget. The mention of organized crime connections sent another ripple through the assembled drivers. These were men who understood the difference between highway robbery and actions that could bring retaliation from professional criminals. Big Jim addressed Carter directly. "Son, you've stepped into something bigger than truck stop robbery. That money Earl was carrying belongs to people who have been conducting business in Louisiana long before you were born. Taking it was the biggest mistake you'll ever make." Carter's bravado was beginning to crack as the full scope of his predicament became clear. Not only was he facing the mobilized trucking community, but he had also stolen money from criminal organizations that had resources and reach far beyond anything his highway operation could match. "We didn't know about the connections," Bull Morrison said, speaking up for the first time since his cousin Jake had arrived. The massive man looked increasingly uncomfortable with the situation he found himself in. "Ignorance isn't going to protect you when those New Orleans people come looking for their money," Big Jim replied. "Your only chance is to return what you took and hope they're feeling merciful." Rodriguez approached Carter with obvious nervousness. "Boss, we've got movement on the highway. Looks like law enforcement finally showed up." The distant sound of sirens confirmed Rodriguez's report. After hours of isolation, help was finally arriving in the form of Louisiana State Police units, responding to reports of suspicious activity at Boudreaux's Landing. Carter's face contorted with rage and desperation as he realized his criminal empire was collapsing in real time. 3 years of building an organization, establishing territory and generating revenue were about to end in a single night, all because of a broken horn and the chain reaction it had triggered. "This is all because of you," Carter snarled at Tommy. "Your disrespect, your broken horn, your refusal to pay tribute. None of this would have happened if you just followed the rules." Tommy felt a surge of anger at the accusation. "The only rules I know are the ones about treating people with respect and making an honest living. Your rules were never legitimate." Big Jim intervened before the confrontation could escalate further. "Carter, you've got maybe 5 minutes before the state police arrive. Use that time wisely. Return the money you stole, surrender peacefully, and maybe you'll live to see a courtroom instead of a cemetery." The sound of sirens was getting closer, and Tommy could see flashing lights in the distance as multiple patrol units approached the truck stop. The isolation that had allowed Carter's operation to flourish was about to end permanently. But Carter Mills was a man who had built his identity around control and intimidation. The prospect of surrender, even in the face of overwhelming odds, went against everything he believed about himself and his place in the world. "I'd rather go down fighting than spend the rest of my life in prison," Carter announced to his remaining supporters. "Anyone who wants to walk away, do it now. Anyone who stays, we settle this the hard way." Several of Carter's men immediately began moving toward their trucks, apparently having no interest in a suicidal last stand against impossible odds. But a core group of perhaps 6 men remained loyal to their leader, either through genuine commitment or simple fear of the consequences of abandoning him. Bull Morrison faced the most difficult choice of all. His loyalty to Carter was professional rather than personal, but his family connection to Jake created a conflict he couldn't easily resolve. "Bull," Jake called out to his cousin, "this is your last chance to do the right thing. Walk away from this while you still can." The massive man looked from his cousin to his employer, clearly torn between competing loyalties. "Jake, I got too much invested in this operation to walk away. Carter gave me a chance when nobody else would." "And now he's asking you to die for him," Jake replied. "Is that really worth it?" Big Jim stepped between the two cousins, understanding that family dynamics could complicate an already dangerous situation. "Bull, you seem like a decent man who made some bad choices. Don't compound those mistakes by making one final bad choice." The state police units were now visible on the entrance road to Boudreaux's Landing, their emergency lights painting the Spanish moss in the oak trees with alternating red and blue flashes. The sight should have been reassuring to Tommy, but he knew that law enforcement's arrival might actually trigger the violence that everyone had been trying to avoid. Carter pulled a pistol from his jacket and pointed it toward Big Jim. "Nobody moves until the police leave. This is private business and we'll settle it privately." The threat against Big Jim immediately changed the dynamics of the confrontation. The assembled drivers had been willing to negotiate and give Carter opportunities to surrender. But threatening their leader crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Jake Morrison's military training took over as he assessed the tactical situation. Carter and his remaining supporters were outnumbered 5-1, but they were desperate enough to be extremely dangerous. The confined space of the parking lot meant that any gunfire would put everyone at risk, regardless of their allegiances. "Carter, put the gun down," Jake said, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to command situations. "This ends now, one way or another." But Carter's response was to cock the hammer of his pistol, a sound that carried clearly across the parking lot, despite the approaching sirens. "It ends when I say it ends." Tommy found himself at the epicenter of what was about to become a battlefield. The broken horn that had started this chain of events seemed almost laughable now, a tiny mechanical failure that had somehow unleashed forces that threatened to destroy lives and families. The 1st State Police unit rolled into the parking lot just as the confrontation reached its breaking point. The officer behind the wheel immediately recognized that he was facing something far more complex than a simple truck stop disturbance. Multiple groups of armed men faced each other across the asphalt, and the tension was so thick it was almost visible. "Louisiana State Police," came the amplified voice from the patrol car's speaker system. "Everyone put down your weapons and separate immediately." Carter's reaction was swift and desperate. Rather than surrender to the authorities, he fired a shot toward Big Jim's position, apparently believing he could eliminate the opposition's leadership and regain control of the situation. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Jake Morrison, operating on combat instincts honed in Vietnam, returned fire instantly. Other drivers, many of whom were armed and experienced in dangerous situations, responded to the threat against their leader. Even some of Carter's own men, faced with the reality of a gunfight against overwhelming odds, began to reconsider their loyalties. What followed was not the organized battle that Carter might have envisioned, but a brief, chaotic exchange of gunfire that lasted less than 2 minutes, but changed everything for everyone involved. Tommy dove for cover behind his Peterbilt as bullets began flying across the parking lot. The sound of gunshots mixed with shouting voices, screeching tires, and the continued wailing of police sirens as additional units arrived to find themselves in the middle of an active firefight. When the shooting stopped, the parking lot of Boudreaux's Landing looked like a war zone. Carter Mills lay motionless near his truck. His criminal empire ended as abruptly as it had begun. Several of his supporters had surrendered immediately when they realized the hopelessness of their situation. Others had fled into the Louisiana night, leaving behind vehicles and evidence that would eventually lead to their capture. Bull Morrison had been wounded in the exchange, but his cousin Jake was already providing first aid while calling for medical assistance. The family relationship that had created conflict during the standoff now provided a pathway toward redemption and healing. Big Jim Thibodeau had emerged unharmed, his reputation for surviving difficult situations intact. As he surveyed the aftermath of the confrontation, he began organizing the crowd of drivers to assist law enforcement and provide witness statements about Carter's criminal operation. Earl recovered his stolen money, though he would spend months looking over his shoulder, worried about retaliation from the criminal organizations whose business had been disrupted. Eventually, those fears would prove unfounded, as the New Orleans people decided that Earl had been an innocent victim rather than a willing participant in the theft. Tommy sat on the running board of his truck, his hands shaking as the adrenaline of the confrontation began to wear off. The drilling equipment he'd been so worried about protecting was undamaged, and his delivery schedule, ironically, was only slightly delayed, despite everything that had happened. As dawn broke over Highway 12, Tommy finally made the phone call he'd been unable to make all night. Marie answered on the first ring, her voice heavy with worry and sleeplessness. "Tommy, thank God. I've been so worried. I heard on the radio there was some kind of trouble on Highway 12. "I'm okay, baby," Tommy said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm coming home." The investigation that followed would reveal the full scope of Carter's criminal organization. Operating under the cover of legitimate trucking businesses, the group had been responsible for dozens of robberies, several kidnappings, and at least 2 murders of drivers who had refused to pay tribute. Their operation had generated hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegal revenue over 3 years, money that had been used to purchase weapons, vehicles, and political protection. The Highway 12 massacre, as it came to be known in trucking circles, marked the end of organized criminal control over major freight routes in Louisiana. The state police, embarrassed by revelations about how long the operation had functioned without detection, increased patrols and established better communication networks with the trucking community. Big Jim Thibodeau became a hero to drivers throughout the South, though he always insisted that the real heroes were men like Jake Morrison and Tommy Broussard, who had stood up to intimidation despite being outnumbered and outgunned. Jake Morrison returned to Arkansas with his cousin Bull, who eventually recovered from his wounds and found legitimate employment in Jake's small trucking operation. The family relationship that had nearly been destroyed by criminal activity became stronger as both men worked to rebuild their lives on the foundation of honest work and mutual respect. Tommy Broussard's broken horn was repaired for $37 at a truck stop in Mobile, a mundane ending to an extraordinary sequence of events, but the lessons he learned during that night in Louisiana stayed with him for the rest of his driving career. He became an advocate for better communication between drivers and law enforcement, and his story became part of the folklore that bound the trucking community together. The truck stop at Boudreaux's Landing was eventually sold to a national chain and renovated beyond recognition. But older drivers still remember it as the place where the trucking community stood up to criminal exploitation and reclaimed their highways through courage and solidarity. In the years that followed, Tommy would tell his story to rookie drivers and law enforcement officers, always emphasizing that the real tragedy wasn't the violence that ended Carter's operation, but the 3 years during which honest drivers had suffered in silence because they felt powerless to fight back against organized intimidation. The broken horn that started it all became a symbol within the trucking community, a reminder that sometimes the smallest mechanical failures can trigger the largest consequences, and that the difference between surviving and not surviving often comes down to the courage of good people who refuse to be intimidated by those who would prey upon the innocent. Highway 12 returned to its status as a quiet alternative route through rural Louisiana, but it was forever changed by the events of that summer night in 1979. Drivers who passed through would remember the price that had been paid for their safety and the brotherhood that had united to protect one of their own when a simple horn malfunction had put him in mortal danger. The official death toll from the Highway 12 massacre was 11, Carter Mills and 10 of his associates who had chosen to fight rather than surrender when their criminal empire collapsed. But the real victory wasn't measured in lives lost, but in lives saved, as the elimination of the extortion network allowed thousands of drivers to travel safely through Louisiana without fear of criminal predation. Tommy Broussard kept his promise to his daughter Sarah and made it home in time for her school play. As he sat in the auditorium watching her perform, he reflected on how close he had come to missing not just one performance, but every moment of her life that was yet to come. The broken horn had nearly cost him everything, but in the end, it had also revealed the strength of the bonds that held the trucking community together. And in truck stops from coast to coast, drivers would continue to tell the story of the Highway 12 massacre, adding their own details and interpretations until it became legend. But at its core, it remained the story of how a mechanical malfunction, criminal ambition, and the courage of good people had combined to create one night that changed everything for everyone who traveled America's highways. The lesson of Highway 12 echoed through the trucking community for decades, that civilization is always fragile, that predators will always seek to exploit the vulnerable, but that when good people stand together, they can overcome any threat to their safety and their way of life. Based on real events that occurred in Louisiana in 1979, names and some details have been changed to protect the privacy of those involved. The trucking industry's response to highway crime during this period led to improved cooperation between drivers and law enforcement, making America's highways safer for all travelers.